welcome to today's edition of Liberty Action Network TV. I'm your host, Doreen Finkel, and today we are going to be talking about taxes. Many of us want to know why they keep going up and up and up, and they never keep coming down, and also more of them keep coming out of our paychecks on a daily basis. And with us today is our guest, Mr. Dave Corsi. He is from a group called the Fair Tax, correct?
Correct.
And you are the district director as well as the public speaker for the Fair Tax.
Director for public speaking for New Jersey Fair Tax.
Right, and can you give us a background and tell us what you do?
Sure. My full-time profession is real estate investment. We buy mostly single-family houses, renovate them, and either rent them out or turn around, fix them up, and sell them.
Okay, and so can you also give me a little bit of background about what you do?
Within New Jersey Fair
Yes.
Tax. Okay.
Yes.
New Jersey Fair Tax is the statewide organization for a national movement called the Fair Tax. What it is we try to educate the folks about the current tax code and the fact that something needs to be done about it. And we have a solution called the Fair Tax, and it would be a national consumption tax, a national sales tax, if you will. So when you go to a store and buy a product, you pay a tax then, and you are done. It would eliminate payroll taxes, income taxes, corporate taxes, estate taxes, the dreaded alternative minimum tax. All those taxes are thrown away and replaced with one simple tax. And best part of all, for many people, April 15th becomes just a normal day. They don't have to worry about filling out hundreds of pages of forms. They don't have to worry about ever being audited. They go to a store, they buy something, they are done. It would be a tax on all new goods and services. So used products would not be taxed.
And so let's just talk again about the Fair Tax. Can you tell me what their principles are and what they stand for?
Okay. I could do that probably best by giving you a little bit of the background. 20 to 30 years ago, it started in Texas with a group of businessmen who had a little mastermind type of group every week. They would meet and they would discuss social issues, problems. At one of the meetings, one of the gentlemen came and mentioned the fact that he had just came from meetings at his corporation and with the accountant and with the tax attorney. And he said it seemed like over 50% of the time they were discussing issues dealing with their company, it had to do with tax policy within that company. And he thought that was just a terrible way and use of their time when they could be out producing products, making better products, expanding their business. So one of the other folks there made the challenge to him, well, why don't we try to come up with a better tax code than the income tax code of the United States? And they all thought that was a good idea. They hired a group of economists to come up with what they thought would be the proper way to raise revenue. And when they did it, they thought they were going to come back with some kind of flat income tax, a flat tax based on income. And when the economists came back, they had come back with a national sales or consumption tax, being that they felt consumption was a much better way to raise revenue than income, which in many cases it would be. Simply, for instance, recently in our recession, what happens during a recession? Unemployment rises, and when you fund things like Social Security and Medicare, they are funded by your payroll tax. Less people working, less revenue coming in for Medicare and Social Security. So therefore, the revenues in Social Security and Medicare went down, and they actually went negative, meaning more money was going out than coming in since 2010, which obviously is a recipe for disaster. Under the Fair Tax, it would have been much more stable because ever since the Great Depression, consumption has never gone down year over year in the United States.
Wow, that's incredible. And before, I noticed that we were talking about the national sales tax. Can you
Correct.
explain that?
Okay, the national sales tax, the fair tax would be a tax where you'd be paying at the point of sale. It is different than a value-added tax. A lot of folks make the mistake of thinking it's a value-added tax. A value-added tax is a tax that's put on at each level of production. when a product is produced, let's say there were 10 parts to that production, each group in there would have a tax put on it from there. So at the end, for instance, if you bought a loaf of bread, the bread was $2 a loaf. After value-added taxes were hidden in the cost of production, you go to the store, that same loaf of bread might cost $2.50. Now, the average person is going to go there and say, gee whiz, they raised the price of the bread. Oh, these shopkeepers, all they're looking to do is make a bigger and bigger profit. Meanwhile, that's why politicians love the value-added tax. It's a hidden tax where they're not blamed for the fact that taxes rose, so they like it for that. The fair tax is different. It's a tax that shows up at the end, like, for instance, the New Jersey sales tax. On a receipt, you see exactly how much you paid in sales tax. Under the fair tax, it would be a very similar circumstance where you'd see exactly how much you pay at the end. And once again, the beauty of it is, without having payroll taxes taken out, income taxes, etc., outside of state withholding, you would get 100% of your paycheck. If you made $1,000 a week, you would get a paycheck of the $1,000 less whatever your state withholding would be, which is a big plus for the average person right now.
And that might lead to my next question, because on the Fair Tax site, it said that they were able to explain how everyone can keep their paycheck.
That's exactly what they're talking about. Everyone, in effect, would get their whole paycheck, less state withholding, because the fair tax is only dealing at this time at the national level. Several states, by the way, have tried to implement a statewide fair tax, and they've come very close. In Missouri, it just failed by one vote. So some states are getting the idea of using it instead of their normal way of taxation, whether it's property, excise taxes, etc. So they're looking to change over to a statewide fair tax. But think about this. If a person makes $1,000 a week right now, and let's put them in the lowest tax bracket we have, 15%. Currently, he would probably get $1,000 less his income tax, taking out payroll tax, all the other taxes. They would probably net maybe around $725. Under the fair tax, you would have the $1,000. Take out in New Jersey, state withholding on someone like that would probably be about $60 to $70. They would get their paycheck for $930. Would you rather have your paycheck give you $930 or $725?
Of course, the $930, yeah.
Exactly. And you would have the right to determine how much tax you pay by what you do with the money. Now, some people are afraid to say, well, what if people stop spending? Which is kind of ludicrous, because nobody goes to work just to make money to put it on their kitchen table so they can stare at it all day. What are you going to do? You work to make money to go out and consume things. Now, ideally, people will consume and save, a good combination of the two, but ultimately, all the money that ever comes in is only worth something if it's used for some kind of consumption purpose.
Now, it was also to my understanding that a person would get a tax refund in advance if they purchase basic necessities.
Okay, no, it's not a tax refund. What it is, what makes the fair tax very unique is because a lot of people will think, well, wait a minute, well, how would that be fair? How could it be fair that everybody's paying the same tax rate? For instance, a family that doesn't have much income would be paying at the same rate as somebody like Warren Buffett on necessities. Because the thing about the fair tax is there are no loopholes, which is a great thing for us as far as being taxpayers, because the so-called special interest groups, the lobbyists, the politicians can no longer control you. But the problem would be, let's say a family of four makes $40,000 a year. Meanwhile, Warren Buffett makes maybe $50 million, $100 million a year. Mm-hmm. Would it be fair for that family, when they go buy the basic necessities of life, food, shelter, clothing, to be having to pay that same amount as Warren Buffett? Because obviously Warren Buffett could afford it much easier. Under the fair tax, we have what we call the prebate. In the prebate, at the beginning of each month, you would get back the tax that would be paid to cover your basic necessities. The United States government every year puts out a table saying what a person has to spend for basic necessities. For instance,
Right.
that family of four would have to spend approximately $26,000 to meet their basic needs. The fair tax rate is 23%. 23% of $26,000 comes to approximately $6,000 a year. $6,000 a year divided by 12 would equal $500 a month. So at the beginning of each month, that family would receive a check for $500 to cover their necessities. So that would put them on a level playing field with every other American. By the way, the prebate would only go to legal American citizens or people who are here legally. If you're an illegal resident, you would not get the prebate.
So in other words, that's how everybody will pay their fair share.
Right. Under the fair tax,
Okay.
right now, currently, probably maybe 80 to 100 million taxpayers are in this country. We've all heard the statistic that 47% of Americans are not paying tax, right? We heard that during the last presidential
I've heard that,
campaign.
yep.
Under the fair tax, think about it, everybody buys something. So now you would have over 300 million people paying tax. You would have tourists coming to America paying the tax. You'd have criminals paying the tax, because even they go in stores and buy things. And illegal aliens, if they go to a store, they would pay the tax.
Wow. And can you also explain how this affects the Social Security and Medicare funding?
Okay, how it would affect Social Security and Medicare. Like I mentioned before, when unemployment goes up, the revenue that is put into the kitty for Social Security and Medicare goes down. Inverse relationship.
Okay.
Under the fair tax, and there also, by the way, there's a limit. For instance, $113,000. If a person earns over $113,000, he stops paying Social Security and Medicare taxes. But under the fair tax, every item purchased, a portion of that will be appropriated towards Social Security and Medicare, which means it would be on a much stronger foundation. So they would raise more revenue for Social Security and Medicare. Yes.
So then more doctors would want to participate, I guess, because I don't know about that.
I don't know about doctors participating, but the point would be, again, consumption is a much more stable tax base than income. And the beauty, again, of it is politicians lose control to tell us and dictate to us how we spend our money. When Bill Clinton was president, he made a statement one time that he was bragging that there was a surplus, and somebody asked him, well, will you give us our money back if there's a surplus? He said, well, I'd like to, but quite frankly, we don't know if you'd spend it the right way. Those are chilling words. He
Wow.
was saying that it was his determination. He will decide how your money is spent. And I don't want Bill Clinton or anybody else in Washington taking my money, determining it. I want to determine how much I will be spending in taxes. The great thing about the fair taxes, it is truly voluntary. If you and your husband decided to buy a car, you have a choice. Remember, I said before, used products do not pay the tax. If you decide to buy a used car, you will not have to pay the tax. But if you go purchase a new one, you will pay the tax. Which leads to the fact that a lot of people say, well, gee, nobody will buy new products anymore. Remember, I said that corporate taxes are removed from the equation. That means a lot of embedded taxes that corporations already pay will come out, which will lower their cost. People say, well, how can we be sure that a corporation will lower its price? For instance, a coat that costs $100 may have $20 that are embedded taxes. Harvard did a study and said approximately 22% of the final cost of a product you purchase is embedded taxes. Now, I don't believe all of that will come out, because part of it is also payroll tax that they're paying for their employee. Now, an employee may say, well, gee whiz, that money then should go back to me. So people may even see a rise in their paycheck. But back to the point that
Right.
if the embedded taxes are removed, prices will come down. Why? How do we know that will happen? Simple. I always use the example of Jackie Robinson. When Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in baseball, the Brooklyn Dodgers didn't have to make a decision. They already made theirs by signing Jackie Robinson. However, every other owner of a Major League Baseball team had a decision. Were they going to allow the Brooklyn Dodgers to have a monopoly on all the great black ball players in the Negro Leagues? Because if they did, between the great white ball players the Brooklyn Dodgers had and the great black ball players, they were going to win the World Series every year. So these other owners, because of free market pressure, immediately went out and started scouting the Negro Leagues, and the next thing you know, you have Willie Mays, Hank Aaron, Larry Dolby, all these great ball players coming in to Major League Baseball.
Right.
That's the
right.
beauty of the free market, and that's how it would work with the fair tax. Another example is the airlines. Whenever one airline lowers its fare to a certain city, what do all the rest do? They immediately follow suit.
Right.
Beauty of the free market.
Right, because of the competition.
Absolutely.
Right, and I want to go on to my next point. Where does the IRS fall in all of this?
Okay, the IRS, at the very least, their power and authority would be much more limited than it is now. Because currently, the IRS has the power to intimidate through what?
Taxes, yes, an audit,
Through
yes.
conducting an audit and scaring half. People get a notice from the IRS, they go into mass panic.
Well, like the
there's-
Tea Party.
Right, and exactly. And there's plenty of horror stories and how they were targeting conservative groups. Now under this, the IRS, if they are in their current state, all they simply will be is the collection agency. What will happen is each state will collect the tax and forward it to a national group in Washington, be it the IRS or some other group. Now, a lot of advocates of the fair tax believe the IRS will be terminated. I don't necessarily believe that will happen. To me, the important point is that control goes from the government, the politicians, the IRS, to the American people. That's what makes it so successful.
And that's not what we have right now.
No, it's the exact opposite. Right now, it's top down. Politicians are very lax about jumping on board. And a lot of people think, well, why? Simple. You're literally asking them to give up how they got into power. You're asking them to give up a great amount of their power. You're asking lobbyists that one of the main reasons there are lobbyists in Washington, Trenton, where have you, is because of tax policy. Suddenly, if nobody has any special exemptions or special rights, they lose it. And they tend to talk with forked tongue, lack of a better term. Warren Buffett is always talking about how, the rich should pay more taxes. But I notice he doesn't practice what he preaches. Barack Obama, this last tax return showed he only paid 18%. Meanwhile, he keeps talking about redistributing wealth. Forget about redistributing wealth and just putting in a level playing field so everybody knows what the tax policy will be, and then you can act accordingly. I put more faith in the average American taking care of himself than some bureaucrat in Washington.
Right, and again, I keep mentioning to our audience that our taxes go up every year. We're paying
Right.
more, especially in real estate, and
Right.
whatever.
By the way, I should mention the fair tax is designed to be revenue neutral, meaning right now, if the federal government is bringing in about $2.3 trillion through the current tax code, the fair tax is designed to bring in approximately the same amount. The government works under what they call a static budget analysis. So whenever there's a change in tax policy, they don't input into it whether it will raise business activity or lower it. They always go under the assumption it will keep it flat. So we go under the assumption that it will be flat, but in reality, the business will take off. Because if there's no corporate tax, incidentally, the United States has the highest corporate tax of any industrialized nation in the world. That puts a drag on our economy because currently U.S. national companies are holding over $11 trillion offshore. They will not bring it back to the United States. That includes General Electric, General Motors, Apple Computer, every big corporation you can think of. Why? Because they know if they expatriate the money back to the United States, immediately 35% of it will come off the top. So they have banks in other countries. They will simply keep it there and use it there. For instance, General Motors, just so the folks know, every year has made a profit, even when we bailed them out. But the profit was made worldwide. And GM's executives were not going to bring it back in the United States and pay a 35%. So the U.S. taxpayer had the privilege, I say that sarcastically, of bailing them out. And the
Right,
politicians
right.
went along with it because they don't want everybody to realize how badly they've screwed up the system. The current code is over 70,000 pages. Not a single person has ever read it, can comprehend it, or understand it. It's literally a national disgrace that we are running this nation on a code that is so screwed up nobody understands it. The IRS commissioner admitted a few years back that he couldn't do his own taxes because he didn't understand the tax code. If it wasn't so serious, it would be funny. It's literally a national disgrace. And if we don't do anything about our tax code, we are literally assigning our children to financial slavery.
Wow. And you had touched upon businesses, okay, and I want to get into some specific ways in which fair tax will actually help businesses.
Okay. One of the ways I mentioned, you're getting rid of embedded taxes. American products become more competitive. Currently, if GM produced a car in America and sold it in France, they would pay the tax in France, where the car was sold. Then, if the money came back to the U.S., you would pay the tax. Meanwhile, let's say a French company such as Peugeot built a car in France, sold it in America. The French would rebate back to them the taxes they paid in France. The United States works off of a disincentive. We do not do anything to build up our exports. And ultimately, we cannot have a trade imbalance every month. We've literally, for 40 years, had a trade loss every month. And you'll hear some economists say, well, that's okay because they bring the money back here and spend it here. Well, how do they spend it? They buy our debt. So we are getting back the money in the form of a loan that we're paying back to them plus interest. They lend it back to us, and we do it again. We are literally siphoning dollars out of this country. So now you have the prospect of watching Ben Bernanke and the Treasury Department keep printing dollar bills, quantitative easing, making believe that will solve our problem. It's not. We are literally the Titanic headed towards the iceberg, and it has to come from the people. The politicians down in Washington, some of them get it, a lot of them don't, but the people have to rise up and let them know they will not accept this anymore.
But maybe the politicians in office, they just don't either get it or they're pushing another agenda.
Yes, another agenda is primarily the reason. Again, their self-interest. Politicians' number one rule is what?
Is to get reelected. Yes.
All they care about is getting themselves reelected, earning their pension, and trying to be out of Dodge before the you-know-what hits the fan. Because when it does, they don't want to be the guy left holding the bag like musical chairs. They want to be able to go on talk shows and say, well, when I was there, none of this happened. We had things stable, and they let it go to pot. This has been going on for over 40 years, and every year they add to it. President Obama keeps having every year $1 trillion deficit, which is added to a national debt that on the books is showing $17 trillion. Under our current tax code, there is literally no way that we can ever pay that off. It's mathematically impossible, which is why I said before, we are putting our children into financial slavery and servitude. That has to end.
Right, and I just want to mention something you touched upon with the exports and the businesses. So you're saying right now that the businesses would benefit?
Absolutely, under the fair tax. The embedded taxes come out, so the products become more affordable when we go sell them overseas. And when we sell overseas, we'll start bringing money back here because we're actually producing something somebody wants. When your number one export is one of the things that's our leading export is scrap metal for a country that was the greatest industrial power in the world just 2 generations ago, that is a national disgrace.
Right.
And tax policy is a big reason for that. Not high wages. Everybody jumps at high wages. Guess what? Japan had high wages when they were kicking our butt in the 80s. Germany has high wages.
Right.
That's only a part of it. When you couple that with a tax code that calls for 35% tax rate, you're setting yourself for disaster.
Right. And I want to ask you this because I deal with the youth and I work with the youth, especially on campus. What would you say to a college kid? How would you present this to a college kid?
I would present it by explaining to them if we don't do something. They already know. The college kids are pretty sharp about this. They already know they're being screwed. They know they're being set up. They know that if we keep on our current course with Social Security, it's not going to be there for them, no matter what a politician says or how many blue ribbon committees that they appoint. So the kids get that part. So we would show them that if we don't do something about getting rid of all these loopholes, this high tax based on income, which basically stifles people from growing. How many times have you heard people say either they can't leave their job because of their benefits? Same thing with the tax code. They're afraid to leave a job or do something, the government, because of their tax rate. So we're screwing these kids. And a lot of people say, well, I'm not working overtime because Uncle Sam gets most of it. You're killing incentive.
Right.
And so the kids would, by that, the kids intuitively understand that unless something is done, it's not going to be there for them, whether it's Social Security or any of these other government programs.
If you were in my shoes,
Right.
would you encourage them to run for office?
Absolutely. They have to get involved. I'm a firm believer in term limits. I hadn't mentioned before, but I ran for Congress a couple times. And unfortunately, I didn't win. But part of what I talked about was two of the things I mentioned, besides the fair tax, was term limits. I strongly believe in term limits. I always love listening to a politician tell me what to eat, what to drink, what kind of car I can drive. But then if you talk term limits, all of a sudden they turn into a flaming libertarian who says, you're infringing on my rights. I get it, so you can tell me what to do all day long. But when I mention, gee, maybe you should go out and get a real job and live in the real world for a while, they're going to panic. Also, pensions. I cannot understand why some congressman gets a pension from the American taxpayer. They're big boys and girls. Let them save some of their own money, open a 401k, and fund their own retirement. I think that's a national disgrace.
Right. And we're currently running out of time right now.
That's fast.
And so can you mention the website, or do you have a
Okay,
website?
to learn more about the fair tax, I'd urge people to go on to www.fairtax.org. Also, there is a bill in Congress. It's H.R. 25, the fair tax bill. Currently, no New Jersey congressmen or senators are supporting it. We have been working diligently for years to get them on board, and we're hoping again, the only way they will, quite frankly, is if they hear from their constituents who say, look, you either support tax reform, favor the fair tax, the flat tax, anything but our current code, otherwise we're going to vote you out of office. That's the only language they understand.
Okay, and mention that website once more.
www.fairtax.org.
Okay, and Dave, I'd like to thank you for coming on our show today.
Thank you.
Of course, you're welcome again. And to our viewers, for more information on our show, please go to campusteaparties.com. That's campusteaparties.com. And I'd like to thank you for listening and watching us today.